we could end poverty in this country for couple of years worth of the defense budget if we were so inclined. But of course we're not, because we need to have a strong military to fight back on the threat of places like Venezuela, which I know that people are on edge because of the threat that Venezuela poses to us as a nation. It was palpable today on the subway.
Never underestimate the threat of a good example.
And we also know that if there is a Venezuelan-Cuban axis that is formed, maybe, who knows, they could in some way, I guess, disturb the equilibrium with our beach, with our tourism in some fashion, if their beaches become too attractive. Who knows? But here's Mike Pompeo saying that there is a problem with Cubans intervening in Venezuela. Wow.
That's absolutely right on all three counts. It is the case that central to Maduro's security has been the Cuban kleptocracy. They've cut a deal with the Venezuelans for tens of thousands of cheap barrels of oil every day. They provided security for Maduro. It's frankly, if you're a Venezuelan military leader, it's a bit embarrassing to have to hand over your senior leader to the Cubans and say, you take care of him. What we've done is we've raised the cost for Cuba. We began that several weeks back. We've put on increased pressure on Cuba. There's more to follow. You've seen what the president has just communicated. We're going to raise the cost. If Cuba wants to continue this malign activity and wants to continue the destruction of Venezuela, that's going to come at an enormous cost to the Cuban leadership.
How many of those Venezuelan generals that Mike Pompeo dreams will turn on Maduro and sign up with Guaido? How many of them are going like, oh, Mike Pompeo really hit me where it hurts? I feel embarrassed. He's right. I feel embarrassed about the fact that we're working with the Cubans.
Working with our historical ally that we've
Right.
actively collaborated with for decades.
Right.
To
How
humiliating to
How-
fight a foreign power to resist the Yankees with a government that survived since the early 60s despite multiple assassination and coup attempts. Embarrassing.
So embarrassing. I'm going in to resign my commission right now and sign up for, and I love the idea, like, look, to be talking about, and this is not a defense of Maduro or anything, but just the idea that we are talking about like how horrific it is that this kleptocracy using their national resources to get aid or help from another country. I mean, I was being facetious when I said people on the subway were worried about the Venezuelan threat. The reason why we care about Venezuela is because of their oil. It is our kleptocracy that is just pissed that someone else's kleptocracy is getting a hold of this stuff.
Yeah, and a little bit of a good example. If socialism works in a country, people might get ideas over here.
Yeah, I'm not sure that under Maduro things are working out that well, that it's such a great example. I think what is more concerned is just like our mafia essentially wants what somebody else has, and we're just moving in. They took our turf. We're taking the turf back. That is basically what's going on here. And the idea that we would get involved in this is just like, far
right politics in Florida. That's another dimension that you always have to attend to with this stuff. It's filled with extremist exiles from all of these countries, including places. I have to bring Brazil into this. Lula has not only did not adopt a path of militancy, he literally submitted himself to prison. I mean, as he said in his interview last week, he's like, look, a lot of people saw this coming. I have a commitment to Brazil, so I've chosen this, even though it's totally unjust. So, I mean, the other lesson, if you wanted to reconfigure it, and obviously this means no difference to the gangsters you're talking about, but like, you had essentially one country with the youngest social democratic party in the world leading it, following democratic norms and hugely delivering for people. The U.S. undermined them, and now they have a literal fascist in charge. And Venezuela, which has followed a much more confrontational and maybe at times problematic path, but they're resilient. Part of the reason they are resilient, too, is that for all of the problems, if you look at the pro-government demonstrations, they are filled much more diverse faces. And that is another element of this.
And I think that Venezuela would be doing a lot better if they had a somewhat sympathetic president of the U.S. that was not imposing sanctions on them. Like, much of the crisis has been externally imposed.
Bush, Obama, and Trump even more. So but lift the sanctions, and then we can all see precisely where all of the government of Venezuela's failures are.
If socialism is such a disaster, or like social democracy, because it's not even really socialist, if it's such a disaster, why do we have to do so many things to make sure that it fails?
Along those lines of doing so many things to make sure it fails, Pompeo was on with Wolf Blitzer yesterday saying that Maduro would have left. Now, understand, Mike Pompeo is on there because when he says like, oh, the generals of Venezuela should be embarrassed because the Cubans are telling them what to do. When he's on TV saying that that Maduro was about to leave, this stuff is like, I mean, this is, I want to be clear here. I don't want our government officials to be good at promoting coups, but it is a little bit hilarious to see how bad they are at this. Like, this is, if I have the savvy to know Mike Pompeo's lying, and he wants to make it seem like Maduro is leaving the country, that knowledge would spur members of the military to jump to Guaido because they don't want to be the last guy on the Maduro team after Maduro has left the country. They want to go in early. You see this dynamic in any political movement. You see it in campaigns. There's a reason why unions, if they think one of the candidates is going to win, they'll jump on that campaign early because they're going to give them more influence in the conversation. But it is so transparent what Pompeo's doing here that, come on, dude, go get your CIA guys at the New York Times to write an article about it or something. Like, don't be so ham-fisted as to get out there and say it on Wolf Blitzer. They're going to know you're saying it. But here he is trying it anyways.
Elaborate, Mr. Secretary, on what you said earlier, that he was apparently ready to leave, head off to the airport, Maduro, but the Russians talked him out of that. Is that right?
That's right.
So you blame Russia for the violence right now?
He was headed for Havana.
We'll talk about that. How do you know?
I can't tell you. You see this. You see all the open source material that's out there. There's lots of information. We're talking to scores and scores of people on the ground, civilians, talking to folks in the military. We're talking to opposition leaders. Many, many conversations that have given us every indication that the fact that Maduro's plane was parked on the tarmac and he was preparing himself to depart is a fact.
So wait, go back. I mean, every indication that it was a fact. I mean, he's fabricating this from whole cloth, and it is so naked. Like, this is minor league stuff that we're watching. This is Bush League, folks.
Model UN stuff.
Honestly. But here's the weird part. Not only that, okay, so now the United States would love it for Maduro theoretically to leave, right? I mean, that's their stated position. Leave, get out of the way, let Guaido assume the presidency. And Pompeo feels like, if he gets this rumor out there that Maduro is about to leave, the military will abandon him. But then he goes on to say this, like, they're not doing this well.
Civilians, talking to folks in the military, we're talking to opposition leaders, many, many conversations that have given us every indication that the fact that Maduro's plane was parked on the tarmac and he was preparing himself to depart is a fact.
So you want him to leave the country? You don't want him to stay in the country, even if he gives up power. Is that what I'm hearing?
That's right. There's no way that Maduro can stay in the country in a nation that he has so.
Wait, what happened? There was another part after that where he had said something, but
that he is so devastated. I think was
but there was another line afterwards where he said something to the effect of,
"Who the fuck are you, dude? That's not your country."
Are you talking to me? Or are you talking
no,
to
I wasn't talking to you. I was talking to Mike Pompeo.
Yep.
But there's more dramatic effect if I say it as if I'm addressing him in the room. Also, like, I mean, if you get pushback from Wolf Blitzer on any U.S. foreign policy talking point, that's astonishing. I think that's the first time I've even seen Wolf Blitzer even like raise an eyebrow.
So he goes on to say, all right, well, he was headed for Havana, and I don't.
And Maduro denies that, by the way.
Well, of course. I mean, of course. Because he'd leave. He'd leave if he wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, it's still unfolding, but I read last night that Guaido said he had the support of the whole military, and then it turned out to be like 70 people, some of whom were maybe tricked.
70's not the whole.